All right, welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for coming to today's rather unique format of a book talk. My name is Katie Nowak, and I am a program manager here at the Ohio History Center. I am so thrilled to introduce today's author to you, but before I do, I'd like to go over how today's program will work. You may have noticed that our author is not physically with us here today. She is joining us virtually from out west. And just to make things a little bit more complicated, we are live streaming this program out to social media. So, hello, social media. I will introduce our author, and she will present for 45 minutes. Afterward, we can ask the author a few questions. You are welcome to submit them as you think of them. We've got note cards up here, too, if you think about something and you want to write it down. So we will present those questions to her, and then we will hear from one of our programming team members about the updates we're making to our interpretation of the Underground Railroad field trip experience. Those of you watching virtually will not be able to ask questions during our program, but if you do have something that you would like to ask, you can submit your questions to info@ohiohistory.org, info, I-N-F-O, @ohiohistory.org, with the subject line, live stream question, and we will make sure that you get an answer. We also want to thank you all in advance for experimenting with this dual virtual program with us. And now I am very pleased to introduce today's author, Kathy Schulz. Kathy is the former library director of Wittenberg University, where she also served as a reference librarian. Raised on a family farm in Northeast Ohio, she has deep roots in the state and degrees from 3 of its universities. She lived at 2 major Underground Railroad junctions and wants Americans to know that the Underground Railroad was mostly in Ohio and mostly above ground, not in tunnels. Kathy holds a BS in Education from Ohio State, a Master's of Library Science from Kent State, and a Master's in Humanities from Wright State. She regards herself as a soldier in the information revolution from her library days, though she discovered fascinating information about anti-slavery activity the old-style way, from yellowed papers in library archives. Kathy and her husband currently live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where she stays busy with friends, hobbies, and grandchildren. Kathy, take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very nice introduction. And I'm glad you made clear I very much am an Ohioan, even though I am coming to you from my retirement spot out west. I want to reiterate my thank you to Katie, who had to put a lot of pieces and parts together to get this program to happen, and to the Ohio History Connection in general, because they were extremely helpful to me in researching my book and things like images, and they are wonderful to Ohio researchers and authors. Okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit. Katie's told you some. I'll tell you a bit more about myself and how I came to write the book. We'll talk about the book, and I'll show you a few slides. I'll do a reading, and we will end with a Q&A, and that should take better part of an hour, I believe, all of that. Okay, yes, I'm from Northeastern Ohio, specifically Columbiana, Ohio, Columbiana County, Ohio, which had a high importance in the Underground Railroad. And I can't remember not knowing about the Underground Railroad as I was growing up. I actually had a pretty accurate understanding of it, even as a little kid. I like to say that before I knew what the word metaphor meant, I understood that that term, Underground Railroad, was just a fancy name that adults had given this thing that had happened in our county and other places. It simply meant that the Black people coming north out of slavery had stayed in the homes and the farms and the towns right around where we lived. I knew there were no trains, no tunnels. So I had a pretty good understanding, and I was always interested in the Underground Railroad. Then, yes, 30 years later, I became a librarian, and I was at Wittenberg, as Katie said. This was probably in the 1980s, in the pre-internet days when we worked from paper most of the time. And as she said, I was poking around in among yellow papers in library archives and came across this a summary of a local Underground Railroad incident. And I want to tell you just a bit about it. It was dealt with a freedom seeker, an enslaved man in Kentucky named Addison White, who got himself out of Kentucky across the Ohio River, came to central Ohio to the town of Mechanicsburg, which is just a bit northwest of you, and it wasn't far from Springfield, where I was working. So the freedom seeker, Addison White, goes to Mechanicsburg, and they send him to the home of a man named Udney Hyde, who always helped freedom seekers. Udney said, "Sure, come on, let's get you rested and fed, but just in a few days, I'll help you keep on moving north toward Canada because it's not safe to stay in any one place for too long." Well, those were the plans, but plans can go awry. And what happened was that the white man, Udney Hyde, became injured. His leg was hurt very badly, and he couldn't do his farm work. He couldn't do his blacksmith work. And the freedom seeker, Addison White, had a look at him and said, "Well, Mr. Hyde, you can't do your work. I don't need to go on to Canada. I will stay here and help you." Udney Hyde wasn't sure that that was a good idea, but it was true that he needed help. So he agreed. The two men agreed, and Addison White lived with the Hyde family for 9 full months, all over during the winter months in spring and fall. And he was paid, and he helped Udney Hyde with his work. Now in the spring, some more drama occurs, and we're going to return to that later in the talk. But what I want to share at this point was this story that I found in yellow paper in library archives just blew me away. I thought this is one of the best American stories, but it made me a little sad and a little angry because I thought, why don't Americans know this? Why don't Ohio kids learn this in school as they grow up? This Addison White fellow is an American hero. He's sort of like Ohio's Johnny Appleseed or Paul Revere or someone of that nature. And I wondered if I could do something to spread the word about Addison White. I did nothing at that time, but I never forgot the story of Addison White. Now, after another 30 years, just 5 or 6 years ago, I did a DNA test, and my results were not surprising. I'm made out of Northern European stuff, just like I thought I was. But what it did, it got me interested in my family history. I thought, well, I'd like to see the real cast of characters. Who were these German people, and who were the British Isle people? So I started mapping out my family tree. But what I saw from that was that, oh my, I have some family lines in Ohio from very early 1800s. And I looked at where they lived, and I saw that some were Quakers and some were Presbyterian, which was another thing strongly associated with the Underground Railroad. There were additional churches represented that I didn't know about at that time. But I looked at these folks and I thought, oh my heavens, is it possible that I have ancestors who assisted in the Underground Railroad? No one in my family knew that. We had never been told that, but it certainly looked possible and even probable to me. So what that did was inspire me to learn more and more and more about the Underground Railroad. What I wanted to know was, if these folks were involved, what had that life been like? There's so much misinformation and folklore about the Underground Railroad, which I did not trust. And it turns out, no, we shouldn't trust a lot of that folklore. But I wanted to get to fact, what had really happened. So I was reading everything I could get my hands on, including the material of Dr. Wilbur Siebert, which is there at the Ohio Historical Connection, which I could access online. But I studied the Underground Railroad. When I started, I didn't think I really knew much more about it at age 66 than I knew at 6. I'd heard all the folklore, but I didn't have that much fact until I did the research. Now, as I was doing that research, some novels were coming out, and I wish I were live with you. I wish I were in the room and I would ask you directly what you thought of some of these books. The major novel that came out during that period was the novel entitled The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. Some of you probably know that book, and there were a few other ones. Colson Whitehead used magical realism. What he did was tell a story of the underground, a fictional story of the Underground Railroad, with the idea that there really had been real trains in real tunnels running around. And, when this is how the enslaved people got away. A lot of people thought his novel was brilliant, and he won a boatload of awards for it, including a Pulitzer. What I'd like to ask you, if you liked it, it turned out I did not like it. It actually annoyed me. It annoyed me greatly because I was learning more and more about the Underground Railroad. And I thought he was doing a disservice to Americans. He wasn't telling that story correctly. It wasn't so much about his little fantasy of the trains and the tunnels. It was where he set the story. He told that story as if this railroad had worked in the deep South, in Georgia, in South Carolina. And I wanted to scream, no, the Underground Railroad is in northern states. In fact, it's in Ohio primarily. So I also noticed that folks that I knew who read that book and other books about the Underground Railroad, I'm in a book group with some women who are extremely insightful and brilliant and educated, and they usually, have the smartest comments about things. But when we read anything about the Underground Railroad, I heard them say some of the oddest things. They were misinformed. And it made me realize, oh, Americans really do not know much about this subject. And I thought, well, why doesn't someone write an entertaining, easy to understand book that explains what the Underground Railroad really was? And that led me one day, by chance, I happened upon this quote by Toni Morrison, our Ohio writer we lost just a few days ago, and we celebrated her birthday a couple days ago too. Or we lost her a few years ago, excuse me. We celebrated her birthday the 18th of February. If there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. I read that and I thought, oh my, am I actually the person to do this? And I thought, well, maybe I do have the background to write about the Underground Railroad. So that is largely what led me to write the book. Now that gets us to the book. And I want to say that the book represents me teaching myself what I wanted to know about the Underground Railroad. And the main thing you learn right away is this slide right here. Let's look at that slide. I hope maybe you're familiar with that slide in Ohio, or Ohioans are familiar with that slide, but I find most Americans certainly are not. That is the generally accepted understanding of routes of the Underground Railroad. And look how Ohio-centric it is. It numbers of people in the Underground Railroad is always a tough thing to come up with. But scholars think that at least half of all Underground Railroad traffic came through the state of Ohio. You can see there's a little bit in the east, in eastern Maryland, and by Philadelphia, you have Harriet Tubman and William Still and some folks. And you have a little bit of stuff that happened on the Atlantic Ocean out of ports like Charleston and Savannah. But primarily Underground Railroad traffic happened in the Ohio Valley. And also the thing to point out, it was, other than these shipping routes, it was a function of the North. It was something that happened north of the Mason-Dixon line, north of the Ohio River. Why is that? Because in the South, there actually were a very few noble and intrepid people who would help people getting out of slavery. The helpful people were very, very few and far between. They did not know each other. They weren't able to work together. So there was nothing even getting close to a network. where you had the network of people working together from one station to the next to the next. That was in the northern states. And that's why we say the Underground Railroad was in the north, not the south. Now, in the book, I go back and spend a good bit of time looking at Ohio history because I wanted to figure out, well, how the heck did that ever happen? Why are those roots in Ohio? So let's go to Ohio history here, and I spend some time on this map. This is early settlement of Ohio, how Ohio got carved up for settlement. And let's go through this just a bit. Starting in the northeast part, you have the Connecticut Western Reserve up by Cleveland and that whole area. And of course, that was New England folks. Along eastern Ohio in the counties below that, and that's one of my county, and further down, those were heavily settled by Quakers. Many Quakers came to those areas in eastern Ohio. And then that gets you down to the Ohio Company purchase, which again, New Englanders. So the people I've named so far would definitely have an anti-slavery bent, okay? Now, what about everybody else? You probably know that Ohio was settled, a lot of the settlement was done by veterans of the American Revolution and then of the War of 1812. When the men fought for the American Revolution, there was barely money to pay them. The country had very little money, but in the end, they said, well, we can give you these land grants in Ohio. So many military veterans were getting these land grants. And let's talk just a bit about those military veterans. Another thing I remember from my childhood, I think I had an elementary textbook that had a picture of George Washington sitting on his horse with a lot of white soldiers standing around him. That picture is incorrect, actually, because there were many African American soldiers that fought in the American Revolution. And I'm glad we seem to be recognizing this more and more. In fact, by the end of the Revolution, perhaps up to a quarter of our troops were African American, perhaps. So what does that mean for those folks who were coming into Ohio? Well, if you served a long time in the military and you had to get a land grant, it was quite likely you had fought side by side with someone not your race. Units were simply integrated. It was no big deal. So I'm not going to say that all those veterans had completely egalitarian attitudes. That would be going too far. But we do like to think that they had a certain level of familiarity and acceptance, and that was part of the attitude being brought into Ohio that became more accepting to Black folks. But then you might be noticing, hey, whoa, what about that Virginia military district over there? I talked to a friend of mine in Northern Ohio. He had no idea there was such a place. But yes, there was a certain part of Ohio set aside specifically for veterans from the state of Virginia. Excuse me a minute here. Okay. Virginia was a very large and powerful state. And if you go back to early revolutionary times, of course, it included West Virginia, but it also included Kentucky. So Virginia went all the way to the Mississippi, a big, powerful state. And they said, wait a minute, you've got all these acres up there in Ohio, but we're worried you're going to run out before all our men get theirs. So there was a certain section set aside for Virginia. And of course, if you go there, you can still get a little bit of a Southern flavor. As you go to the Connecticut Western Reserve, you get a little New England flavor even today. So you look there and you think, well, wait a minute, those folks were probably pro-slavery. And yes, some were, but it was a mixed bag and a self-selecting group. Because let's think about the process of getting this land grant and going to Ohio. The men who got those fully understood that there was no slavery in Ohio, going back to the 1787 Northwest Ordinance and then the 1803 Constitution. They understood if they came, if they were a slave owner, they could no longer be that in Ohio. they needed to free their slaves or sell them, or many of them brought their enslaved folks with them with the understanding they would be free in Ohio. So anyway, it was a little bit of a mixed bag and a self-selecting group, people willing to leave the slave economy that came to Ohio. A slave owner who wanted to continue being a slave owner perhaps could have wrangled a military grant in Kentucky. So anyway, we have these folks coming into Ohio that tend to be anti-slavery or at least mildly so in some cases. And also some of the folks coming out of the South, including some of those Virginians, actually hated slavery. They had lived among it. They had seen it. They did not like how things were going, and they wanted out. So Ohio was the place to come. A lot of the Quakers along the eastern part of Ohio, many of them had come out of the South. Okay, now I'm talking a good bit here about people coming, and I'm overlooking an important group. I'm talking mostly about white people, and I should be talking about free blacks. So let's talk about the black people coming into Ohio. Yes, some of those black soldiers got military grants, just like the white folks did. We don't know how many, but we know some did. And we know that other black people were coming into the state for other reasons. There were people in the South who managed to get their freedom. There were a number of people who did. Maybe they had a benevolent owner, but another situation was if not all the male slaves of the South were working on plantations. Some had jobs in factories and foundries. And the way things worked back then in pre-assembly line days was every man had a quota of what they had to produce, say, how many gears per day or whatever it was they were working on. If they produced more, they were paid bonuses. And there were a number of enslaved workers who could save those bonuses up over time and buy their freedom. Some female seamstresses did the same. But, some of these enslaved folks simply escaped. But if you were an enslaved person and you managed to get your freedom, you were in a southern state, you actually had a bit of a problem because and I'm going to move on to the next slide here, I think. Here, I'll tell you about this slide in a minute. In the southern states, the constitutions of those states were written assuming an enslaved status for black people. So even if you had your freedom papers, you could, after a few months, you could legally be swept back into the slave economy and resold legally. So some free blacks managed to figure out a way to live safely in the South, but many of them realized, oh, wow, we better get out of here. Let's go to Ohio. Ohio was an obvious place to go because of the freedom written right into the lack of slavery written into its constitution. Now, I put up this slide of the Gist settlement. I'm showing you that because many of the they could live anywhere, and they did, anywhere all over Ohio. But a lot of the black people coming into Ohio in the early days chose to live together in settlements. And this is a marker from the Gist settlement, which is down in, it's big. In fact, it's a couple different, there's different sections of it. It's in Brown and Highland County towards Cincinnati. Samuel Gist was an incredibly wealthy Englishman who owned huge tracts of land in Virginia and between 300 and 500 enslaved people. In his will, he freed all of them and made arrangements for them to be taken to Ohio and have land bought for them and buy, lumber, farm implements, seed, whatever they needed to get them going. So those settlement, it's all gone now. It didn't actually, they struggled. There's a long story to that. But this is an example of the type of settlements in early Ohio involving many Black people. All over southern Ohio, there were settlements like that, and on up near Columbus. You folks are in Columbus, Africa. I used to wonder, why is this place called Africa? It's out by Westerville, if I remember correctly. But it had been a Black settlement. Now, why this is important. These Black settlements were important, and all the Black population in Ohio was important, because in the early days of the Underground Railroad, it was primarily people of color helping other people of color. People have been trying to get away from slavery back into the 1700s, and they didn't find too many white folks who understood their plight and would help them in the earliest days, but other people of color would. Now, there might have been a very few Quakers in Eastern Ohio operating after 1810, 1815 in the Underground Railroad, but there weren't many. It was largely people of color. Why am I specifically saying people of color? There's a reason. Because in Northwest Ohio, you still had an Indian population. What that means is they hadn't yet been pushed out. They weren't, not until the age of Jackson, which is around 1830, were these folks pushed out of Northwest Ohio. And there are records of the Indian population helping freedom seekers coming through. Neither one of those groups was overly fond of white folks. I don't know why they would have been, but they were happy to help each other. So in Northwest Ohio, you did have Indians who were a part of the Underground Railroad. Okay, now, yeah, this next slide. This is probably the most important slide in the whole presentation, because if you understand this slide, you understand why it all happened. Why on earth did all those people come into Ohio, all those freedom seekers? Well, this will tell you. You cannot talk about slavery without talking about cotton. And this is about cotton in the early 1800s. Eli Whitney and the cotton gin happened in the 1790s. By 1800, there's this thing called King Cotton going on down south. The cotton fields had moved away from the East Coast into the Mississippi Valley. The soil fertility wasn't so great in the East anymore, but they had Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi. They had those places to go. And so they were starting to grow tremendous amounts of cotton there. They were also making tremendous amounts of money. But they needed workers. This is new land. There weren't workers there. They needed them. Where were they going to get these enslaved workers to work this cotton? They were not going to get them from Africa, not after 1807, because both England and the U.S. stopped slave import, the international slave trade at that time. So that sounded like a good thing to stop the international slave trade, but what it did was put more pressure on the existing enslaved population. So if you were a Southern cotton grower looking for where you were going to get workers, you had the Natchez Trace, which was a fairly decent road by then that you could go up, and you went straight to Kentucky and on to Ohio. But better than that, you had steam riverboats. And I believe, I don't know, the 1810, 1815 period was when we first got the steam paddle stern whalers that could go upriver, which was a very big deal. And it was always easy to go down rivers, more of a challenge to go up. But now you could go up. So you were going to go up the Mississippi, and you were going to go up the tributary of the Ohio, and you were going to go along the state of Kentucky with its long river border and an enslaved population. Kentucky actually became the go-to place to get these enslaved workers to sell down the river. And I meet people out west here that have no idea where that phrase came from. As an Ohioan, I knew to be sold down the river, that's sold down into the cotton fields. But anyway, Kentucky became where people looked to get those workers. And it became such a strong pattern that Southern cotton growers regarded slaves as an agricultural product of the state of Kentucky, much like you would look at horses or tobacco or bourbon, those Kentucky things. Well, slaves were what you got out of Kentucky. Now why? Well, slavery was never acceptable anywhere. However, some of the enslaved population of Kentucky had a more tolerable life than, say, in the Deep South. you had maybe one white family working for one black family and a small farm, and the relations were sometimes acceptable. Workloads were okay. There was food. But the main thing then, men and women were able to marry, to couple, to have babies. You had a birth rate. So you had you had healthy population in Kentucky, but the work, most of the work was elsewhere. So that's how that pattern got set up. Now, I'm going to stop for a drink here. Excuse me, when I talk, this happens to me. Folks, the enslaved people of Kentucky, they understood what was going on. They saw the pattern, and they feared their families being broken up, as they were. So they wanted to get out of Kentucky. Some of these folks were mistreated before they fled, but many were not. Many who came into Ohio said that they came as family groups, or they didn't, as husbands and wives, they knew someone might be vulnerable to be shipped down into the cotton. So that is why so many people left Kentucky and came across the river into Ohio. And you can also say, well, hey, wait a minute, what about Indiana? Yes, some did go to Indiana, but the laws and the attitudes were slightly better in Ohio for part of the reasons we just talked about. So that is why there was such a strong pattern of traffic from Kentucky into Ohio. Okay. What else? Okay, what else happened right around that period? Let's go to the next slide. The War of 1812. Now, what on earth does that have to do with anything? Well, it had quite a bit to do with something, and it taught a lot of Americans about Canada. Uneducated folks, which generally would include the enslaved, hadn't really heard or thought much about Canada, except then the War of 1812 came along. And a lot of that war was fought up on the Great Lakes or near the Canadian border and the St. Lawrence Seaway. And I think that's Admiral Perry on Lake Erie there. We probably know that. But this meant that many American soldiers went north towards Canada, including Southern soldiers. When Southern soldiers went off to war, they often took a servant with them. So they might take an enslaved person with them. And of course, there were free blacks also fighting in this war. So when the war was over, people all went home and they started talking about Canada. Oh, there was no slavery at all in that country, and they accept all kinds of people. So it kind of it filtered down into the black population, the enslaved population, that Canada might be a good place to go. That was a pretty uncommon thought to have before the War of 1812, but it became a common goal after the War of 1812. Okay, now, if the enslaved people become aware of Canada and they think that might be a good place to go, how many of them can really do it? Typically, it was people who lived fairly close to those northern states, in the border states. If you were in the South, as I said, you weren't going to get much help to get out of there. And if you were taking a land route, there weren't many options besides walking. That was how you were going to go. There are some examples of folks who made it out of, say, Tennessee, the Carolinas. There are some of those folks that made it north, but they were few and far between. Primarily, the people who got out of slavery and came across the Ohio or across the Mason-Dixon line were really in that blue band that I drew along there. There's nothing magical about it. It just means that they were maybe 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, a 3-day walk. A person could do that. They could figure out how to get that done. But to come further on a weeks-long journey was a pretty difficult thing to do. Oh, I know. This is a good time to talk about numbers. Again, I said numbers can be, they're always estimates. But when I've spoken in person, people will say, oh, well, how many people are you talking? How many people use the Underground Railroad? And scholars typically land somewhere around 100,000 people. Over the entire antebellum period, you can think loosely from 1800 to 1860, total of 100,000 people managed to use the Underground Railroad and get to freedom. 100,000 is not a large number. What can help you understand that is at the start of the Civil War, our enslaved population was 4 million, okay, in 1860. So over 6 decades or so, 100,000 is not all that many, and it was maybe something like 1% of the enslaved population managed to get out. Now, in that blue band, which is where it primarily happened, it would have been much higher than 1%. I never tried to do the math to get anything close there. But anyway, most of the people did come out of the north, out of the border states. But overall, it was not a really large number. Okay, now, there was a crop grown all through the Ohio Valley, in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Kentucky, wherever you want to look at. There was a crop grown that was specifically beneficial to the freedom seeker. And this one's fun to talk about. Corn. Ohioans like to talk corn, I have found. Corn, of course, we know, it grows all summer, and by late summer, fall, it's getting tall. If the freedom seekers, some of them were able to choose their time of year and plan their exit, plan their escape. Some had to go because of a crisis happening, something horrible happening. I have to leave tonight. But a large number of people were able to select when they wanted to go. And if they were able to choose their time, they nearly always picked late summer, early fall. Corn was one of the big reasons for that. I grew up, I think she told you, I grew up on a farm. I know plenty about corn. You can hide in a cornfield. If you wanted to, you could sleep all night in there and they wouldn't find you. You can walk a straight line, but also in the early fall, before those ears mature, the kernels are still soft and you have a product, something like sweet corn that you could eat. So you had a food source. So that time of year, you had corn as well as other food sources. And the other good thing about early fall is that back before we had the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, those are the folks that keep the rivers flowing just perfectly year round and all that. That's the way it works now. Back then, we didn't have that, and there was great seasonal variation in river depths. Rivers and streams. The Ohio was much easier to cross. It was actually low. There were times there were hard to believe, but there were certain times and places when the Ohio River could be waded, and other streams, of course. So late summer, early fall was an ideal time to flee. And in fact, we have a National Underground Railroad Month. I don't know if people even know that. And Ohio announced it as well. The National Underground Railroad Month is September. It also happens to be the month that both Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman were able to flee. So, and a lot of that is due to corn. Now, moving on, remember I said primarily we had Black people helping Black people in the early days of this. But in the 1830s, things started to change. The 1830s is when real railroads came to Ohio. And it's also when white people tended to get involved. Some white people, more and more, were getting involved with the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad also got its name in the 1830s. In 1810, no one knew the word railroad. That was never said. But now in the 1830s, railroads were the new hot thing. And everyone loved that railroad terminology. So it was someone in the abolitionist press that came up with this term, Underground Railroad. So all of this was happening in the 1830s. The people actually using the Underground Railroad and the people helping others, running stations, being conductors, they didn't have they didn't, as far as I could tell, I'm not even sure they called it the Underground Railroad. It was just something they did. But it was the press that came up with this clever name, and it kind of happened more in the press among white folks, was part of white folks getting involved. Okay, now if we have real railroads, let's talk about transportation. Public transportation in the Underground Railroad. And we have to jump back before and talk about the canals that preceded the railroads. Those came in the 1820s, or there's somewhere around there. You had the Ohio and Erie Canal that came up through Columbus and went on up to Cleveland. In the west part of the state, out of Cincinnati, you had the Miami and Erie. Well, when you have these canal boats, anytime you have cargo being loaded and unloaded and men working and things, of that nature, that's good opportunity to hide a person, or, hide away. And it's a good way to get the ride up the canal. The other interesting thing about canals, they had the tow lines, tow paths. You can just faintly make it out there in the canal picture, but where the mules would pull your boat. Canal boats did not run at night, which meant that those tow paths, which were basically north-south roads, pretty much, they were deserted at night. So there were many freedom seekers who used the tow paths as walking trails at night. Now, when you get to railroads, I said 1830, late 1830s, 1840s, you've got good railroads developing. All those things apply to railroads, people and cargo and things like that. But even better, the other thing you can do with public transportation, what else can you do? You can buy a ticket. You can buy a ticket and you can ride, or someone could buy a ticket for you. And it happens that the Underground Railroad had plenty of hiding in plain sight. And you did have people using these trains to move to Canada, or excuse me, to Cleveland, perhaps, where they would then get on a boat and go to Canada. You had people moving as ticketed passengers on trains. That happened more in the northern part of the state. That's why I said Cleveland. They're just in Ohio in general. In the southern part, closer to the river, you had more slave catchers, a little more southern attitude. As you moved north, the further you got north, the more you were in a more and more welcoming population, and your safety increased as you moved north through the state. So anyway, if you want to be a ticketed passenger and ride a train, what do you need? You need to look good. You need to look the part. You need and I borrowed those pictures. I don't know who those folks are, but I like that girl's fancy white dress, and I wanted to use that. But anyway, there was a lot of fundraising related to the Underground Railroad to pay for clothes, to pay for shoes. You certainly needed new shoes. If you wore the shoes that you had worn as an enslaved person, those would have been pretty bad looking, and they were a dead giveaway that you were running away. New shoes, new clothes, that was all necessary. The food for people, housing, things cost money. And so basic fundraising was a part of the Underground Railroad. Okay, so I don't want to go on too long here, and I want to get back to my Mechanicsburg story of Addison White and Udney Hyde, and we'll have time for some questions, I think, but let's get to them. Go back there. Okay, that on the left, you have Addison White. On the right, Udney Hyde. And let me review. White came out of Kentucky. He's staying at the Hyde home, and he's been there for 9 months. But the fugitive slave law is in effect, and there are federal marshals going around looking for people like White and Hyde. There are lawbreakers. Okay, so I'm going to do a short reading from the book, and this is something that takes place at Udney Hyde's home. In this home, Addison White sleeps in a little loft that's up high. It's in the, I don't know, at one end of this cabin-like structure, there's a loft, and that's where Addison White sleeps, and that's where he is. And when the story begins in an early May morning, when the federal marshals come, Another person in the house is Hyde's teenage daughter, Amanda. And Amanda is important in the story. She has taught Addison White to read over the winter. So she's already done this heroic thing, but she keeps doing heroic things. And Addison White's son, Russell, is married and lives in the next farm over. And I think now I've told you what I need to read this. So these federal marshals are out and about, and they come to the Hyde home. They bang on the door, and here they are. White was clearly not coming down on his own, so one of the marshals determined to go up and get him. He started up the ladder, shotgun in hand, not realizing that White was also armed. As soon as the marshal's head appeared in the opening, White fired his pistol. Fortunately, the ball glanced off the shotgun barrel before tearing off some of the man's ear tissue in Van Gogh-like fashion. The dazed marshal fell backward to the floor, convinced he had been mortally wounded. His equally stunned companions fled to the outside, offering no aid. They were unsure what to do and were particularly befuddled by Udney Hyde, who had stayed in bed during the entire altercation. Even after the shooting, he was still in bed. Under his blankets, there was nothing visible about any injury, so through the doorway they asked Amanda why her father was bedbound. Decades later, she claimed to have no idea what inspired her response. He has smallpox. The words burst out of her mouth, seemingly on their own. Already terrified of the armed black man overhead, they now had smallpox to contend with as well. It was about this time that Hyde called to Amanda, "Mandy, it's time to go feed the chickens." Amanda, as quick-witted as her father, knew that he did not give a damn about feeding chickens at that particular moment, but she played along. Grabbing the pail of cracked corn, she plodded out into a damp morning toward the coop. Reaching the chickens, she kept going on a trot. A marshal noticed and hollered at her, threatening to shoot. The unfazed 15-year-old simply ran faster while one of the men pursued. Fleet of foot, she beat the older man to her brother Russell's house. Thinking that he had no quarrel with whoever this neighbor was and that she was just a scared kid, the marshal left the siblings alone. Russell immediately grasped what was going on and ran to find a fast horse. He hopped on and galloped to town. Whoops. Next comes the scene that deserves to be more famous than it is. Like a latter-day Paul Revere, Russell rode through town shouting, "Addison White is being taken! Addison White is being taken!" A lot of people who ordinarily pretended not to know Addison White knew precisely who he was. He had lived among them all winter. He was helping Udney out while Udney was laid up. What good people did. The men and boys of the town, and a few women too, grabbed whatever they could find and headed out through the drizzling rain to the Hyde farm. Pitchforks, sickles, scythes, hay rakes, hoes, carpet beaters, whatever. The mechanics clutched metal rods or their sharpest tools. A large rabble of people brandishing improvised weapons soon appeared at Hyde's cabin. The wounded marshal had finally collected himself enough to find he only had a bleeding ear and, discerning that he was not about to die, had rejoined his companions outside. Once again, a full group of 8, they were confronted by a spokesman for the damp and shivering townspeople, many of whom had not bothered to wear coats. He told the lawmen in no uncertain terms that they had 5 minutes and 5 minutes only to leave. Seeing no other options, the lawmen did. The anti-slavery leanings of Mechanicsburg were well on display that day, and the town had won round 1. But the battle was far from over, and everyone knew it. Okay, that's all I'll read, but the story goes on. There's more. There's more that happens. Amanda gets to be a hero again. Addison does further heroic things. But I do want to show you, Addison, well, guess where Addison settled and lived out his days. And maybe I really wish I were in person with you and I would ask if any of you have heard of this, because a few people are now learning this story. But Addison he lived in he never left Mechanicsburg. He actually he fought in the Civil War. He was in the Massachusetts 54th and the famous Black Division. But when all that was over, he came back and settled in Mechanicsburg, and that's him on the left. And his third wife, he had a couple wives that died. Life was difficult back then. That is his wife, Amanda Barrow White. And he lives in Mechanicsburg, and I'll show you quickly. These are his great grandchildren, a brother and sister, John and Sherry Booth, who, in addition to those yellowed papers in the archives, they also helped me uncover his story. And there we are in the Maple Grove Cemetery, I think it is, in Mechanicsburg, where Addison White is buried. Okay, that is primarily what I have. We could talk more, but I think it's probably about time for me to wrap this up. And maybe Katie or someone will come rescue me. Where are we now? What do I do now? I can keep talking if no one tells me not to. I guess I should not share my screen.
You sound like me. I would keep talking too if
Okay.
people did. You're totally fine. So we did offer folks the chance to write down any questions that they may have, because we want to make sure that we have enough time to introduce one of our other team members here. Did anyone have any questions before we kind of carry on? Oh, the Ready in the Basket. We have a system, I promise.
We have a whole basket of questions.
So we've got some questions in the basket that some of our folks are writing. So here in a second, I will read them over to you.
Okay. I guess while we fill time, I will say I've touched on this. There were parts of Ohio where the Underground Railroad was dangerous, parts where it was less dangerous. And sometimes there was a need for speed and for hiding. Other times, really not so much. And these folks might have lived with their host, station keepers somewhat normally. All right. And hardly any tunnels. Hardly. Did we talk much about that?
So I have some questions. Two of them are actually the same. What are some key stops in Ohio along the Underground Railroad?
Oh, wow, there are so many. That is the whole point of Ohio. It is a spider web of stops, and if I start naming names, you could name dozens of towns in Ohio. Now, there are some that are better known than others. Oberlin is a pretty well-known one. Ripley, Ohio. I didn't talk much about Ripley, but it was it's on the Ohio River, upriver from Cincinnati, about, I don't know, less than an hour. But it was probably the busiest town per capita in the whole United States in the Underground Railroad. They think about 3,000 to 4,000 people moved through Ripley during that antebellum period, and similar numbers moved through Cincinnati as well. Very important. But the thing is, Ripley was a small town, so per capita, Ripley was very important in the Underground Railroad, and has two, maybe three actually, museums there. The home of Reverend John Rankin, who was a Presbyterian minister, very important down there, and the home of John Parker, who was a Black man who had gotten himself out of freedom. Out of slavery. There's also a Presbyterian church there. Red Oak Presbyterian Church is still a functioning congregation, and it goes back to the 1700s, and it was always an abolitionist church. Anyway, Ripley is one of my favorite places to talk about, obviously, and Mechanicsburg, because I like the story. And Salem, Ohio, which was my birthplace and was the Quaker city. Okay, does that answer it?
The ohio.org website, Ohio Tourism website, lists some of the historic sites that you can visit. The Rankin House is one of the sites listed. So it's a great resource for you to get a starting point. And then another question would be where to buy your book, but I can actually help answer that question if you don't mind.
Sure, go right ahead.
We do have copies of The Underground Railroad in Ohio in our gift shop. So you can stop by the gift shop if you'd like, and then the publisher website as well. I believe Kathy has an author website that links to her book as well. So those are two good resources for that. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for your questions. Again, if you are attending virtually or if you think about a question afterwards, you can always submit those questions to info@ohiohistory.org with the subject line live stream question, and we will get an answer to you. So before we end our program today, I would like to introduce one of our team members. Her name is Valerie Boyer. She is our coordinator for school and inclusive community partnerships. Valerie is a vocalist, musician, dancer, poet, activist, minister, a historian, but most of all, an educator. Born and raised in Galveston, Texas, Valerie was groomed in Southern hospitality and shares that kindness everywhere she goes. As a member of the National Forensics League, 2012 Miss Juneteenth Ambassador, Black Historian of the Year in 2019 from Upstart Magazine, Valerie has been able to travel the country, but she has also been featured at a lot of venues across Columbus. Valerie has taught social studies for years, most recently at Linda McKinley STEM Academy. She is a proud graduate of Howard University and currently resides here in Columbus. She is the newest member of our team, but has been instrumental in developing new programming, establishing partnerships, and providing a historian's, artist's, and educator's perspective on the work that we do. So, Valerie, would you like to come to the stage?
Hey, y'all. Before I talk more about our programming and ourselves, can we give a round of applause for our beautiful lecturer and author today, Ms. Kathy Schulz, and her instrumental work with discussing the Underground Railroad in Ohio. Thank you so much for that. That's a summary, I guess, of who I am. I am the newest person, School and Inclusive Community Programs Coordinator here, and we do offer an immense amount of programming, including an Underground Railroad in Ohio School Immersive Program, right, that runs from, it's for 4th to 8th grade. And so if your groups or your students or someone you can think of in that age range are interested in coming and hearing directly, right, from some visitors and characters from the past along our Underground Railroad in Ohio, you can book at ohiohistory.com or call in and make a reservation. So that is an option. Also this summer coming, we have our Jubilee program, right, where we are honoring and commemorating the celebration of Jubilee. Fun fact, Juneteenth, prior to becoming a national holiday, has always been celebrated. She told you I'm from Galveston, which is where Juneteenth was read, right? So I've been Juneteenth in my whole life. And so one of the ways in which it has been commemorated even after, so post-Civil War, right? Juneteenth is a thing, but we have sharecropping and we have then Reconstruction and Great Migration and all of these movements. Well, whatever that Sunday was on or prior to Juneteenth, folks of African descent and folks of descendants of these enslaved people would take off and they would have Jubilee. as a celebration. So we still do that. We still do that commemoration, and that too is a beautiful time to hear from some of those voices from the past and during that time. We also have Thunder Mugs and Teacups, where you get to experience what life was, right, in the late 19th century here in our village as well. And I just gave you 3 programs that are going to take us through June, and that's just the first half of the year, right? So I'm looking forward to connecting with you, looking forward to being with you, looking forward to the work that we are already doing and the work that we will continue to do. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, everybody, thank you so much for attending today's program. We do have a collection of sources about the Underground Railroad available if you would like to learn more about this very critical piece in Ohio and national history. We will post those resources online on our event page, so check back in a couple of days for that information. A very key piece of, not a key piece, but a great collection that we have available to view online is our Siebert collection. So you can go to ohiomemory.org and you can find a lot of really great material online. And as I mentioned, it's a great starting point. There is so much out there that to explore and to learn about, and there's a lot more work to be done about this really important topic. So I would like to once again thank our author, Kathy Schulz, for being here with us today, and to Valerie Boyer for highlighting the programming happening at the Columbus campus. To learn more about all the work that we do and the resources we provide, including ways to become a member or donor, please visit our website at ohiohistory.org. Thank you guys very much.